Hello, friends. Welcome to my YouTube channel. Here, I share a brand new story every day. If you enjoy my videos, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Now, let's dive into today's story. This incident is brief, but it was profoundly horrifying for me and my mother. It was around May-June 2019. My father was out of town on business, so it was just me, my mother, and my little sister Lucy, who was 6 years old, at home. One evening, I was in the kitchen, chatting with my mom while she was making dinner. Let me give you a view of our kitchen. The layout was simple. The kitchen was on the left side, and the bathroom was on the other. If you stood in the kitchen, you could see anyone going into the bathroom. My mother was facing the wall, stirring a pot, and I was leaning against the kitchen counter, facing her. Suddenly, Lucy came running down the hallway, went into the bathroom, and slammed the door shut. We thought she was just in a hurry and didn't pay much attention. My mom and I continued our conversation, laughing about something trivial. But in the back of my mind, I was wondering why Lucy had run to the bathroom so urgently. After about 25 minutes, I noticed she hadn't come out yet and mentioned it to my mom. "What's taking her so long?" I asked. My mom looked up from her cooking and frowned. "Go check on her," she said. I walked over to the bathroom door and knocked. "Lucy, are you okay?" There was no response. I knocked again, a bit harder this time. "Lucy?" Still nothing. Feeling a bit of unease, I slowly turned the doorknob and opened the door. To my surprise, the bathroom was empty, with the lights off. Confused and a bit scared, I went back to the kitchen and told my mom, who insisted it couldn't be possible. "She went in there," she said, a note of concern in her voice. Determined to find Lucy, I checked her bedroom. There she was, fast asleep in her bed. My heart raced as I stared at her peaceful face. She looked like she hadn't moved in the past hour. I gently shook her awake. "Lucy, did you go to the bathroom earlier?" She rubbed her eyes and looked at me, puzzled. "No, I've been sleeping. Why would I use the common bathroom when I have my own in my room?" I felt a chill run down my spine. I hurried back to my mom and told her what Lucy had said. My mother's face paled, and she put down the spoon she was holding. "Who did we see go into the bathroom then?" We were both silent for a moment, trying to process what had happened. The house, usually warm and inviting, felt cold and eerie. My mother and I decided to check the entire house, making sure all the doors and windows were locked. We didn't find anything out of the ordinary, but the sense of unease lingered. For the next few days, my mom kept a close eye on both me and Lucy, and we made sure to keep the house well lit at night. The incident left us both on edge, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder more often than before. My mom even called my dad to tell him about it, but he brushed it off, saying it was probably just our imagination. But we knew what we saw. Lucy had run into that bathroom and vanished. The memory of that evening haunted us, making us question the safety and sanctity of our own home. To this day, I still feel a shiver when I think about it, wondering who or what had entered our house that night. This is a true story. We were staying at an elegant manor for my cousin's wedding, a place with a history that spanned centuries. I was 12 years old. I woke up to a rough shove, assuming my sister was waking me. It was early morning, around 7:30. Groggily stepping out of bed, I was immediately hit with the pungent fumes of hairspray. I could hear the shower running, accompanied by hurried footsteps and the repetitive spritzing of a hairspray can. Still half asleep, I walked to the dresser and pulled out a blouse and a skirt. As I got dressed, I heard knocking on my door. Fully dressed, I opened the door to find no one there. A chill ran down my spine, but I brushed it off as my imagination. Exiting the bedroom, I heard the shower shut off as I passed the bathroom, followed by the sound of my father's heavy footsteps. At the end of the hall, there was another restroom. I heard the repetitive spritzing again and called out to my mother, "Hey, Mom, I need to use the bathroom, and Dad's in the other one." I heard my mother's voice reply, "Alrighty." It was definitely her voice, but alrighty was not something she ever said. Rolling my eyes, I walked away. I figured I should wake my granddad, as I heard heavy snores coming from the room he was sharing with my parents. When I opened the door, I was startled to find the room empty. At that moment, the noises and the smell of hairspray abruptly stopped. Panicked, I ran downstairs to find my parents, granddad, and sister Clarissa already eating breakfast. Checking my watch, I realized it was already 10. My mom stared at me with a puzzled expression. My sister then exclaimed, "What the heck?" I asked them what was wrong. Clarissa said, "You literally just went to the bathroom," pointing to the lavatory next to the small kitchen area. I walked over to the bathroom and pressed my ear to the door. Sure enough, someone was inside, washing their hands. I shook it off and counted my fingers, 10 of them. I wasn't dreaming. I knocked on the door, and inside I heard my own voice calling out, "All righty." Turning to my family, I saw their faces pale with fear. Behind me, I heard the lock click, followed by my own voice saying, "Hey there, Sarah." Footsteps echoed in the hallway. I turned around just in time to see my own feet, clad in black velvet flats, disappearing around the corner of the staircase. Paralyzed with fear, goosebumps crawled up my back. I couldn't move for a minute. Finally, I told my family about what had just happened. Clarissa revealed that the previous morning she had woken up to find me missing from my bed. She heard noises from the bathroom and saw me walking down the hall in my pajamas. When she called out to me, I kept walking. Returning to our room, she found me still sleeping in my bed. Terrified, she hadn't told anyone until now. Fast forward 2 years later, my cousin now had a 6-month-old baby, and we were talking over tea. I recounted the eerie experience to her, and she froze. "That happened to you too?" she said, her voice shaking. Goosebumps returned to my arms and legs as she explained that she had woken up one morning to see her fiancé, now her husband, sitting at the table eating cereal. He greeted her and said he was going to get something from upstairs. After a long while, she went to check on him, only to find him still asleep in bed, wearing his pajamas. These unsettling encounters left us both shaken, haunted by the memories and the inexplicable presence that seemed to mirror our every move. The manor, with its rich history, held secrets that we couldn't begin to understand, leaving us with a sense of unease that lingered long after the wedding festivities were over. The first thing you should know is that this story doesn't have an ending. It stops for sure, but there is no climax to the events here. They just sort of fizzle out. Another thing you should be aware of is that this is a true story. Not a true story you might find on certain forums dedicated to them, but a genuinely true retelling of a short-lived period of strangeness during my youth. Of course, some allowances must be made for the sake of narrative, but I will do my best to avoid any embellishments. This is a story of what my friend Leo and I discovered in an abandoned building during the summer of our sophomore year, and the oddities that surrounded those months. Location is important for this story, not necessarily to the events themselves, but rather their character. I grew up in a small town in rural Ohio, surrounded by miles of cornfields and the occasional patch of woodland. The area was a mix of farmland and old, abandoned buildings from industries that had long since moved elsewhere. Most of the strangeness that occurred during that summer took place in an old factory on the edge of town, but eventually spilled out into the community. Growing up in such an isolated place has many benefits. However, the threat of boredom was also a constant. I had known my friend Leo since middle school, and at this time, we were both entering our junior year of high school. We were both musically inclined from a very young age, though by high school, he was much more successful at picking up girls with his guitar and singing voice than I was with my violin. It turns out that classical music didn't have quite the same appeal. He was the more outgoing and gregarious of the two of us, while I was the bookish, introspective type. Leo lived with his mom in an old house near the center of town, and I lived with my parents on the outskirts, near one of the many cornfields. It was a bit of a bike ride to get to Leo's place, but his house was also equipped with the latest tech, one of the few benefits of having a mother who worked in IT. We enjoyed the perks, tokens to make up for her frequent business trips. I always suspected that the factory on the edge of town was one of those places that avoided any successful attempts at repurposing. Built during the early 20th century, it had once been a bustling hub of activity, but had since fallen into disrepair. The structure was surrounded by a chain-link fence that had long been cut through by adventurous kids. Despite various attempts by the town to clean it up or demolish it, the factory still stood, a monument to a forgotten era. It wasn't long after school ended for the summer that Leo and I found ourselves sitting in his room playing the latest video games. Leo was much better at Guitar Hero, and I was better at Halo. It was around then that his mom suggested we get out and get some fresh air. Leo proposed we go explore the old factory, something we had talked about for years but never actually done. I was hesitant but agreed. We grabbed our bikes and headed out. The factory was only a 10-minute ride away. We stashed our bikes behind some bushes and slipped through the gap in the fence. Inside, the air was musty, and the floor was littered with debris. We wandered through the vast, echoing halls, our footsteps stirring up clouds of dust. It was about 20 minutes into our exploration that we stumbled upon the first strange thing: a series of symbols and drawings etched into the wall of what had once been the factory's main office. The symbols were unlike anything I had ever seen, and they gave me an uneasy feeling. Leo, being more adventurous, suggested we take a closer look. We spent the next hour exploring the various rooms, finding more symbols and strange markings. As we ventured deeper into the building, the air grew colder, and the sense of unease grew stronger. We decided to head back, but not before Leo took a few photos with his phone. As we left the factory, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. This incident marked the beginning of a series of strange events. About a week after our initial visit to the factory, Leo called me in a rather excited state. He had done some research and found that the symbols we had seen were similar to those used in old occult practices. Intrigued, we decided to go back for another look. This time we brought a few supplies: flashlights, notebooks, and a camera. On our second visit, we discovered even more strange things. In one of the back rooms, we found what appeared to be a makeshift altar, complete with burnt candles and more symbols. The air was thick with the smell of burnt wax and something else I couldn't quite place. Leo was thrilled, but I was starting to get genuinely creeped out. We took more photos and made some sketches before deciding to leave. As we exited the factory, we noticed a figure standing at the edge of the woods, watching us. It was too far away to make out any details, but it was definitely a person. We hurried back to our bikes and rode home in silence. That night, I had trouble sleeping, my mind racing with thoughts of the factory and the figure in the woods. A few days after our second visit, Leo called me again, this time in a more subdued tone. He had been having strange dreams about the factory and couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I admitted that I had been feeling the same way, and we agreed to meet up and talk about it. We decided to avoid the factory for a while and focus on trying to figure out what we had found. We spent the next few weeks researching the symbols and the history of the factory. We discovered that the factory had been shut down in the 1950s after a series of unexplained accidents and deaths. Rumors at the time suggested that the factory had been involved in some sort of occult practices, but nothing had ever been proven. The more we learned, the more uneasy we became. One evening, Leo and I were sitting in his room going over some old newspaper articles we had found. His mom was out of town on another business trip, so we had the house to ourselves. We were deep into our research when we heard a strange noise coming from the hallway. It sounded like footsteps, but we knew we were the only ones there. We looked at each other, and Leo got up to investigate. He walked to the door and opened it, peering into the dimly lit hallway. There was no one there. He shrugged and closed the door, but the uneasy feeling lingered. We decided to call it a night and went to bed. I slept on a makeshift bed in Leo's room, not wanting to be alone in the house. Around midnight, I was woken up by the sound of whispering. At first, I thought it was Leo talking in his sleep, but then I realized the whispers were coming from outside the window. I got up and looked out, but there was nothing there. I lay back down, trying to convince myself that it was just my imagination. The next morning, we decided to go back to the factory one last time. We felt like we needed to confront whatever it was that had been haunting us. We grabbed our gear and set off, determined to get to the bottom of the mystery. When we arrived at the factory, the air felt heavier than before. We made our way through the familiar halls, eventually reaching the room with the makeshift altar. As we approached, we noticed that something had changed. The symbols on the walls had been altered, and there were fresh burn marks on the floor. Leo and I exchanged a worried glance. He suggested we take more photos and then leave as quickly as possible. As we started snapping pictures, we heard footsteps echoing through the building. They were getting closer. Panic set in, and we bolted for the exit. As we ran, we saw the figure again, this time much closer. It was a man, dressed in tattered clothes, with wild eyes that seemed to pierce through us. He started to chase us, shouting something we couldn't understand. We sprinted through the halls, our hearts pounding in our chests. We burst out of the factory and didn't stop running until we reached our bikes. We pedaled back to Leo's house as fast as we could, not daring to look back. When we finally stopped, we were both out of breath and shaking with fear. We never went back to the factory after that. The photos we had taken showed nothing unusual, but the experience had left a mark on us. We tried to put it behind us and focus on our studies, but the memories lingered. As the school year started, Leo and I drifted apart. He became more withdrawn, and his obsession with the factory faded. I focused on my classes and tried to forget the strange events of that summer. But every now and then, I would catch a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye or hear a whisper in the night, and I would remember the factory and the figure that had chased us. That following spring, the old factory was finally demolished. The town decided to clear the land and build a new community center. As the building came down, I felt a sense of relief, but also a lingering sense of unease. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever we had disturbed was still out there, watching and waiting. Leo and I graduated and went our separate ways. He moved to another state for college, and I stayed behind, attending a local university. We lost touch over the years, but the memories of that summer stayed with me. Even now, I sometimes dream of the factory and the strange symbols we found there. I don't know what we stumbled upon in that old building, but I do know that it changed us. The events of that summer are a reminder that some things are better left unexplored, and that curiosity can sometimes lead us down dark and dangerous paths. It was during my sophomore year in college when my friends and I decided we wanted to do something thrilling. We had heard tales of a mysterious street in Savannah, Georgia, called Magnolia Lane, so named because it used to be lined with ancient magnolia trees. As you can imagine, the place had a certain eerie charm. The stories said that this street was home to supernatural beings, ghosts, witches, and other eerie entities. The most famous of these was the Magnolia Lady, a ghost said to belong to a woman who was murdered in that area many years ago. She was known to appear to cab drivers at night, asking for a ride. When the driver agreed and turned to ask where she wanted to go, she would vanish. She was also infamous for appearing suddenly, causing drivers to swerve and sometimes crash. One late night in October, filled with curiosity and the thrill of the unknown, my friends and I decided to visit Magnolia Lane. We piled into an SUV. There were 8 of us in total and set off to find this legendary street. It should have been easy to locate since it was only a few miles from my friend Sam's house. However, as we drove, we found ourselves unable to locate the street or find our way back. We kept circling, passing the same landmarks, the same houses, and the same street signs. No matter how we turned, left or right, we always ended up in the same spot. What was supposed to be a half-hour adventure stretched into 2 hours, and by then we were all pretty scared. There were no other cars on the road, no people, not even a stray dog. The night was eerily quiet, and the tension in the car was palpable. Eventually, we stumbled upon a side street we hadn't noticed before. It was different from the other streets, narrow, just wide enough for a car to squeeze through, and a hand-painted sign on a brick wall that read, "Evergreen Saint." Desperate for a way out, we turned into it. How wrong we were. The street was long, with brick walls on both sides, and our SUV's headlights cutting through the darkness ahead. Nothing else. 15 minutes into the drive, the walls disappeared, and the streetlights vanished. The paved road gave way to a muddy path, and the surroundings opened up to reveal what looked like an old, rural farming community complete with wooden huts and fields. We were supposedly in the heart of the city, yet this scene looked like it belonged to a place at least 4 hours away. At this point, we were all terrified. Someone suggested we turn our clothes inside out, an old superstition meant to confuse any entity that might be playing tricks on us. Desperate, we did as suggested, turned the vehicle around, and retraced our path down Evergreen Say. After a few minutes, we were back on modern roads and soon found our way home. The experience left us shaken. None of us could quite believe what had happened. The next morning, as soon as the sun was up, we drove back to the area to search for Evergreen Street. We spent half the day driving around but couldn't find any trace of it. Despite our best efforts, Evergreen Street remained elusive, leaving us with more questions than answers. The encounter became a part of our shared history, a tale of the unknown that bonded us through the years. And to this day, whenever we gather, the story of Magnolia Lane and our surreal journey down Evergreen Street is retold, a chilling reminder of the night we ventured into the unknown and were forever changed by it. My friend suggested I share my story here, and I finally found the time to type it out. I'm not sure if this would exactly meet the standards of this outlet, but it's definitely the scariest experience I've ever had. At the time, I was only 10 years old and lived in a small mountain town in Colorado, surrounded by dense forests. Almost every house there had acres and acres of forest behind it, which by itself was very scenic. I'm 21 now and live in a bustling city in California. I do find myself missing the setting in my old backyard every once in a while, but it's usually accompanied by the very unsettling memory of what I'm about to recount. By the time I was in 4th grade, I was already trusted to be home by myself whenever my mother went out to visit my grandmother and aunt, who lived only a few minutes down the road from us. I was happy about the arrangement. I was an only child, and my father would be gone for work months at a time. So to me, I was very lucky to have this opportunity. It usually meant late movie nights and video gaming. Every once in a while, I would explore the aforementioned forest, and on the night in question, that's what I was doing. I usually never went too far. There was this tree house I liked to climb, and once I got to the top, I would look out in all directions. The house was always in sight, so I never felt scared or frightened by being there. It felt like my own private little world that I could enjoy. As I was climbing up to my usual spot, I suddenly began hearing a sound from further in. It wasn't a natural sound at all. It was very faint. It sounded like someone crying. I was more puzzled than scared, since crying was the last thing I would ever expect to hear in the forest. I must have listened for a few minutes, convinced that my ears were playing tricks on me, but it was not an auditory hallucination. There was someone, in fact, crying. In my mind, I imagined it was a young girl who had somehow wandered too far into the forest and got lost. I considered going back to the house and calling my mom for help, but then I was worried that the girl would wander further in and go beyond earshot. I decided to try and locate her myself. I made my way hastily through the trees and branches, trying to figure out the exact direction the crying was coming from. It definitely wasn't as easy as I thought. It was a matter of trial and error just to make sure I was going in the right direction. One thing that never occurred to me in the moment was how consistent this crying was. There were no pauses, no words of any kind, just nonstop sobbing and wailing that had no end. What I did notice was that the closer I got, the more metallic it sounded to me. I eventually reached a small clearing that only had a few trees and bushes. I had never gone this far in before, so this was the first time I had ever seen it. When I made my way in, it didn't take long for me to find the source of the sound. It was an old, rusty tape recorder, one of the biggest I'd ever seen. It was protruding out of one of the bushes, and the crying was coming out of the speaker. This was very disturbing to me. I was expecting to find a real person. As I was about to turn it off, I heard another sound coming from just outside the clearing on the opposite side. It sounded like steady footsteps advancing in my direction. It only took seeing a tall, shadowy figure coming my way to send me running. Fortunately, by some miracle, I recognized my way back by identifying the trees and shrubs as landmarks. This probably saved my life. I never looked back and didn't even try listening to hear if that person was following me. I just kept telling myself that I had to make it home. Nothing else mattered. I just had to get home. Once I saw the treehouse I liked to climb, it didn't take long for me to know the rest of the way without needing to survey my surroundings. I was out of the forest in record time, and I immediately ran into my house. locking the door and shutting all the lights off as I went into my bedroom. I didn't want this person to know where I lived, or I would be done for. After shutting the curtains of my window, I peered out through them as discreetly as I could to see if whoever was out there had actually managed to keep up with me. I didn't see anyone, but I stayed by that window for a good hour, waiting for something to emerge from the forest. But nothing ever did. After that, I went straight to bed, and I also was never able to go back into that forest ever again. Months passed, and I tried to push the terrifying experience to the back of my mind. Life went on as usual, but the memory of that night stayed with me, lurking in the shadows of my thoughts. One weekend, my cousin Jake came to visit. He was a year older than me and loved adventures. I hadn't told him about the incident in the forest, and when he suggested we go exploring, I reluctantly agreed, not wanting to seem cowardly. Armed with a couple of flashlights, we ventured into the woods late in the afternoon. I led him to the treehouse, and we climbed up, sitting on the wooden planks and looking out over the treetops. Jake was enthralled, pointing out birds and squirrels, but I felt a gnawing sense of unease. As dusk settled in, Jake proposed we go deeper into the forest. I hesitated, my mind flashing back to the tape recorder and the shadowy figure. But Jake was insistent, and I didn't want to ruin his excitement. We climbed down, and headed further in, with Jake leading the way this time. We hadn't gone far when I started hearing the sound again, the same eerie crying from before. My blood ran cold. Jake noticed the change in my demeanor and asked what was wrong. I told him about the tape recorder and the figure, hoping it would convince him to turn back. Instead, it piqued his curiosity. "Let's find it," he said, and before I could protest, he was already moving towards the sound. I had no choice but to follow. The crying grew louder and more metallic as we approached the clearing. When we reached it, the tape recorder was there, just as I remembered, but this time it was different. There was no bush concealing it. It was out in the open, and the crying was accompanied by faint whispers. Jake picked up the recorder and turned it off. The sudden silence was deafening. We stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do next. Then we heard the footsteps again, steady, deliberate, and getting closer. Panic set in. We turned to run, but something caught my eye, a small, weathered diary lying on the ground near the tape recorder. I grabbed it without thinking, and we bolted back towards the house. We didn't stop running until we were safely inside, the door locked behind us. Breathless and shaking, we sat on the living room floor. I handed the diary to Jake, and we began to read it together. It belonged to a girl named Emily who had lived in the town many years ago. The last few entries were disturbing, describing how she had been followed by a man in the forest and how she feared for her life. The final entry was dated the night before her disappearance. Emily wrote about setting up a tape recorder to capture the sounds she kept hearing, hoping it would provide proof of the man's existence. The crying was her own, recorded out of fear and desperation. Jake and I were horrified. We realized that the tape recorder had been playing Emily's last moments over and over, a haunting echo of her terror. We decided to take the diary to the local authorities, hoping it might shed light on her unsolved disappearance. The police took our statement and the diary, promising to look into it. A few weeks later, we learned that Emily's case had been reopened, and a thorough search of the forest was conducted. They found more of her belongings and, tragically, her remains buried under a pile of rocks. The man she feared was never found, but the discovery brought some closure to Emily's family. As for Jake and me, the experience bonded us in a way we never expected. We never ventured into the forest again, and I never forgot the lesson I learned. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. The forest that once felt like a magical haven now held a darkness I couldn't ignore. Whenever I think of my old home, it's not just the beauty of the trees and the serenity of the landscape that comes to mind, but also the chilling reminder of the night we uncovered Emily's story.